There we go. All right, so welcome everyone. This is our science of, and we're going to be talking about aquatic plants today. So something a little different. We had pollinators last week for pollinator week. So kind of continuing on to the plants. We talked a little bit last week about pollination and how some plants are pollinated by water or wind or pollinators. And last week we really focused on pollinators. This week we're going to focus more on like aquatic plants and that water pollination and how different types of plants in Nebraska specifically look and what types of aquatic plants and why they're important in Nebraska. So we will go ahead and get started here. So again, if you've been on here before, thanks for coming back. If not, welcome. So my name is Monica McCoubry. I am the Wildlife Education Specialist with the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission. So today, let's go ahead and dive into aquatic plants. If you've been on before, you know the drill. If you haven't, like I said, welcome, but just make sure that if you have questions, please feel free to type them in the chat or hold on to them and put them in later, but just make sure that any comments that are on topic and any comments, just make sure we're kind to everybody and that we're just kind of staying on the topic of aquatic plants today, and we'll be just fine. If not, we do have the right to remove you. All right, I also want to point out to everybody that I am by no means an expert. I am an expert in science communication. I have 2 degrees in wildlife, but still I do not believe that I am an expert in anything that I talk about. I do a lot of research. So if you have questions that I can't answer, I will find someone that can help you out and answer those questions for you. So I'm doing my best, but please, please, please ask questions if you have them. All right, so let's go ahead and, like I said, dive into some aquatic plants. When I first decided what I was going to do for Science of, a lot of people kind of do our evaluations, and that's where we get ideas for our new science ofs. A lot of people kept saying plants and aquatic plants, and I thought that was really interesting because I had really not talked about plants in general, not a lot of plant stuff, but also not aquatic plants. That's not my forte by any means. So I learned a lot doing this, and I got to look at some cool books and some cool textbooks while doing this. So thank you to those that suggested it, because I also learned a lot doing this too. All right, so what is an aquatic plant? I'm sure a lot of us in our head have this idea of what they look like and how they're nuisance plants, or they can be nuisance plants. There's some that look kind of weird. There's some that might be cover for different types of animals. There might be some that don't really have a lot of forage value or anything like that. But in the simplest term, an aquatic plant is a plant that grows in the water. That could either be partially in the water or completely in the water. So we'll talk about the differences later, but really what we're talking about is how they anchor. Is it free floating, or is it totally underwater and then they grow above the water, or is it some plants are above the water but just the roots are under the water? So it just really depends on the type of plant, the habitat that we're looking in, and then also the conditions of that water as well. So when we talk about aquatic, there are plants that like shallow coastal zones. There's some that like salt or brackish water. There's some that really like fresh water. There's some that just prefer still rivers and lakes. There's some that like a current. So there's a very huge diversity when we talk about aquatic plants. So they also, like I mentioned, they provide a very important food source for a lot of different aquatic animals, semi-aquatic animals, even terrestrial animals that come to the water to drink or to have a nursery there. So it's not just the animals that live in the water, although those help a lot and they're very benefited by a lot of these plants. And then when we talk about a true plant, there's a lot of plant lookalikes like algae that we'll talk about here in a second. But plants they're going to be a photosynthetic autotroph. So if you remember to like 9th grade biology, what are those words? Don't worry, I got you. So an autotroph is basically an organism that can make its own food. So they produce their own food through that process of photosynthesis. And if you're like, what is photosynthesis? I can't really remember. Basically, it's just converting the light that they get, that chemical energy, and making glucose and starch for their food themselves. So they use the light and they convert it into energy or food. And then another term that you might hear me talk about a lot today is something called a rhizome. If you are familiar with plants, terrestrial plants, you might have heard this word before, but basically it's like this underground root system. And what they do is they shoot out these roots and shoots from a node. And a lot of these plants, like I'll talk about later, this is how they survive the winter. And this is how they move into get to another place, although they use that through pollination, but also this is basically to help them survive the winter. And this is their specialized root system. So you might hear me use the word rhizome quite a bit. I just want to make sure that everyone's on the same page and that we know what we're talking about. So basically, aquatic plants are very similar to terrestrial plants. It's just their habitat or their environment. So plants, in the very simplest term, they have to grow and thrive. And to do that, they require carbon dioxide, they require oxygen, and then also nutrients, light, and water. So plants or aquatic plants have a little bit of a leg up on some of those terrestrial ones because they're already in the water. That being said, it also conveys some challenges for aquatic plants. They have some different characteristics that terrestrial plants do not, and vice versa. Terrestrial plants have some things that aquatic plants do not. So what do they look like when we talk about types of aquatic plants? So you also might hear the word macrophytic. This basically just means that they grow near the water. It's a fancy word. We're just saying they grow near the water. So aquatic plants, these are going to be plants that are large enough that you can see with the naked eye and are usually found in shallow zones. Sometimes if you ever look at like a cutoff, a horizontal cutoff of a lake or a pond or a stream, you know, there's lots of different zones, the deeper that you go or how much light can penetrate through it. We're going to be talking about the littoral zone of lakes and rivers. I have a photo if you're like, I have no idea what that looks like, Monica. So I have a photo here in a second. But basically in this zone, there is still enough light that penetrates to the bottom to support those growth of plants. So even though they're in the water, they still are photosynthetic autotrophs. They have to make their own food and they have to do that through photosynthesis, which requires some form of light or light in general. So here there is sufficient light to help at the bottom to support the growth of these plants. All right, so characteristics of some aquatic plants. Again, not all of them are going to have this, but this is just a very general overview of what they do have. So common characteristics, they have these things called cuticles. Normal plants like terrestrial plants will have them, but on aquatic plants, they're very thin, or some aquatic plants do not have cuticles at all. So basically, this is how they retain water in the plant. So being a plant that lives in the water or grows in the water, you don't have to worry about this a lot because there's water everywhere. So basically, these cuticles are going to be very, very thin on an aquatic plant, or they just might not be there in general because they don't need them. But overall, it's the outer layer of these plants, and it can cover the leaves, the fruits, the flowers, and sometimes the non-woody stems in any of those plants, and it protects against chemicals, it protects against the temperature, the extreme temperatures, it protects against UV rays. So aquatic plants that are fully submerged, they don't need these in the water because there's no point, they're always going to be in the water. And then basically it tailor-made leaves to improve that gas exchange. Basically, they just don't want the plant to desiccate or dry out in the air, but water plants or aquatic plants, they don't have to worry about that. All right, and we've heard of maybe stomatas. So these are going to be on plants. Basically, this is how they gas exchange. There's little tiny openings. If you've ever looked under a plant leaf under the microscope, you'll see those stomatas. Aquatic plants have ones that are permanently open because if they're in the water, they have to exchange those gases. So floating ones have the stomatas, but even at the surface that are in contact with the water, they do not. So with the same purpose of preventing that water loss, plants need the stomata for that gas exchange. Plants that live underwater, they don't really need them, but they still have them. And then also they're going to be less rigid. So if you've ever touched a woody plant, they're pretty upright because there's wind, there's rain, there's stuff being pulled on them, there's animals that go by and kind of brush up against them. They need to be pretty rigid. Well, water plants do not. Usually the water helps support them. So they're just not as rigid as something like a terrestrial plant. All right, they usually have flat leaves on the surface and they have air sacs. So again, that gas exchange, they don't really have a lot of upright leaves, but I'll show you a bunch of them that do. Again, this is some plants, not all, but floating aquatic plants, they need to have flat leaves because they stay on the surface of the water. This is how they float. And then also the roots of plants. So instead of being embedded into the soil and going down 15 feet, sometimes like those prairie plants, they're going to have smaller roots, they're going to be lighter, and they're going to be more feathery in appearance. And when you touch them, basically this helps them to spread freely and to take in that necessary oxygen that they have. So So roots, when we talk about aquatic plants, they are located usually towards the very bottom of the plant. All right, so here's the kind of a good table to kind of show terrestrial versus aquatic plants. A lot of this stuff I kind of talked about. So like terrestrial plants, for instance, they're going to have very strong roots and a shoot system that's going to be present, and it helps those plants survive those harsh conditions. So my first thought goes to the prairie. If you know true prairie plants or prairie wildflowers, there's a lot of extremes on the prairie. There's a ton of like heavy wind, there's heat, there's fire, there's a lot of things that kind of help or hurt those plants sometimes. So they need to be very rigid. Aquatic plants, they're pretty limp, or they're flaccid a lot of the times, just because they don't need to have that rigidity. The water holds them up. Pollination is also going to be very different. So last week when we were talking about pollinators, we talked about some plants pollinate through the water. It's rare, but it does happen. So a lot of those plants in the water can pollinate through the water. However, there are some that have their flowers extended above the water, and there's still a lot of different pollinators that will visit them. So there's a couple different options for them, and we'll talk about some of those today too. So this is kind of a good system to look at, and a good table just to show the difference in the comparison between terrestrial and aquatic plants. All right, so that's just a very basic overview of aquatic plants. And now I want to go through the different types. So depending on who you talk to, there's 3 different types, there's 4 different types, there's 2 different types. I went with 2/3, and I'll show you why I have /3. Mostly there's going to be 3 different types. If you really talk to someone, there's 2 different types, but we're going to go with 3 today. So types of aquatic plants. So if you look at a pond or a lake or stream or something, you'll probably notice that there's lots of different aquatic plants, or maybe you've never noticed, but now you will. So you're going to make those observations when you get to a different place. A lot of the times there's going to be a huge diversity of the different types of aquatic plants. That's really beneficial because it's like having a monoculture, and nothing against our farmers. Thank you for our farmers. But when you look at a field of corn, it's a pretty one scale thing. It's usually corn or soybeans or something else. It's a monoculture. If you look at a prairie, there's a huge diversity. You're going to notice there's more bumblebees. There's going to be lots more insects. There's going to be mammals. There's going to be lots of different types of forbs and woody plants, and there's going to be different types of wildflowers. So there's just a huge diversity, and that's a huge indicator of a very healthy system. That's the same thing as a pond. The more diversity you have, it's going to be a healthier system. So a lot of these water plants, sometimes people see them as a nuisance. They get in the way when you're swimming, they get caught on your fishing line, they don't maybe look the best, but they're very beneficial to a lot of local wildlife and a lot of migratory wildlife. So migratory meaning things that come and go, that aren't necessarily here all the time. My head really goes to like migratory birds or waterfowl that will use a lot of these water spaces a lot of the time. A lot of the water plants, people think they should be eliminated. If they're native and they're helping those local wildlife, I would say they need to be encouraged instead of eliminated. So when we talk about those aquatic plants I mentioned earlier, we're going to talk about them in 3 main groups as far as that management purpose. So the first type is a submerged plant. So if you use context clues, and you understand what the word submerged means, that means they're going to be in the water, the deepest part of that littoral zone that I told you about earlier. So they're rooted in the sediment at the very, very bottom. Here, there's still enough light that's penetrated so that they are photosynthetic, so they can still make their own food, but they can grow up through the water column, and the growth of most of the plant is entirely within the water, and there's usually not any plant parts that emerge. Some of them do, not all, but pondweeds, if you've ever heard of coontail or naiads, there's something called a water milfoil. There's the invasive kind and the native kind. These are going to be those submerged plants. They're going to be in the water. And then you have something called emergent plants. So these are plants that inhabit the shallower zone of that littoral zone, what we're talking about, and they can extend above the water surface, and usually they're rooted into the sediment. So part of them is in the water, and then part of them is sticking out above the water. These are going to be vascular plants that often really have those dense root systems and that shallow soil at the water's edge. So a lot of the time, the shallow end, the end of the very kind of outer skirts of a pond or a lake, this is where you're going to find those emergent plants. If you've ever heard of something called an arrowhead, an American lotus, We don't have mangroves in Nebraska, but if you know what a mangrove is, cattails, bulrush, these are all going to be those emergent plants that are going to be half in the water, half out of the water. And again, these are still part of where they can reach a lot more light. So they have a different type of photosynthetic, being a photosynthetic autotroph. All right, and then this one's a little, some people, if you talk to them, there's only two. This is that third category that I'm going to include, but the floating leafed plants. So these are the ones that just kind of float. They're not necessarily anchored anywhere in the water column. They just kind of free float and they do just fine. So it depends on the species, but they will grow at different depths because they are floating. They're not anchored into anything, but they just kind of float on the surface. They lay flat most of the time. Sometimes they might have a little bit of some stuff that sticks out, but mostly it's just going to be flat against the water. Things like American featherfoil, duckweed, water hyacinth, water lettuce, or bladderworts, if you've ever heard of those are really good examples of those floating leafed plants. All right, so not a great picture, it's a little blurry, it's the best one I could do. But here's what I'm talking about when I look at the zones. So if you go to a lake or a pond, you have the terrestrial plants that are going to be fully on land. They might, every once in a while, the water level might rise and they might get flooded out, but mostly they don't like that water. They want to be up. And then you have the emerged plants where you can still see some of the roots are in the water. And then part of them are up above the water. And then as you get a little bit deeper, you might see some of those floating plants. And then the submerged plants are going to be all the way towards the very, very bottom of that littoral zone. Even again, those submerged plants, the water or the amount of light penetration is not going to be as much as if you were a emerged plant or a terrestrial plant, but you're still getting enough down there to do what you need to do to survive. All right, a lot of people ask us, what about algae? Well, algae is not aquatic vegetation. A lot of people think algae and moss are the same thing. Moss grows on land, algae is in the water, moss grows on trees or other things, but so algae can grow in the water. There's a lot of different species of algae. A lot of people think of blue-green algae. So this is very harmful, but there's also a lot of different type of algae that's good. It's a good indicator of a healthy system, and it's very good for the food chain. There's a lot of different animals that eat that. So when we talk about something, you've ever heard of skunk grass or chara, it's found in Nebraska sand pits and sometimes the interstate lakes. So this is technically an algae, but it functions like a submerged aquatic plant, and it's actually very important within the food chain. Within Nebraska, we do have a lot of freshwater algae. Some of it's good, some of it's bad. A lot of times when you're out in the water, or if you're looking at a lake or a pond, you will notice that it kind of makes a mat, and sometimes it will float at the surface. So it all kind of gets together and it kind of goes and floats as you might see it. And then there's also algae that grows in lakes. And basically, like I mentioned, it provides the basis for that aquatic food chain. So a lot of different invertebrates, a lot of different fish, crayfish, lots of different things will eat that algae. Like I mentioned, that's their plant material that they're eating. So there's small algae that's known as something like phytoplankton, and they're microscopic cells that are actually suspended in the water column. So even when you see a super clear lake and you're like, there's nothing here, there's no floating pondweed or there's no algae, even though the cleanest lake in the world, you're still going to have that suspended floating algae. It's just not going to be in a huge mat like you normally would see. And then also there's filamentous algae that grows as chains of cells, and they form those really large strings or mats. These are going to be sometimes free floating. They can grow suspended in the water column, or they can attach to other things like rocks or plants at the bottom of a lake or a pond. All right, so that was a little bit just about our submerged plants. So the different types of aquatic plants. I see that we have a couple of things in the chat. So someone said, so if algae isn't a plant, what is it? It's algae. So there's algae, there's lichen, there's moss, there's plants. So technically it's cyanobacteria, and there's just different types of it. So algae looks like a plant, moss looks like a plant, moss is moss, algae is algae, plants are plants. So algae is technically like cyanobacteria, but it's sometimes good and it's sometimes invasive and it sometimes can be harmful. It just depends on the species. All right, so Nebraska emergent plants. So when we talk about aquatic plants in Nebraska, there's about 100 species or so that grow here. They're very diverse. They could be very large. They could grow in colonies. But again, just because you see a pond or a lake and there's stuff floating on top of it, aesthetically, it might not be the best thing to look at, but it could mean that that's a very healthy, stable aquatic environment. Unless you're talking about, you know, something like blue-green algae, which again is not a plant, but it doesn't look good, it doesn't smell great, and it's very toxic if you or even your animals ingest it or touch it sometimes. So, but having those aquatic plants is a good sign of a healthy, they're indicator species. They indicate to us that that's a healthy ecosystem. Also, when we talk about larger aquatic plants, they can stabilize the shorelines and erosion, which we'll talk about some of them here in a second. They can really help that underwater soil, and they can even balance out that water, the chemistry of the water as well. All right, so one of them that some of you may be familiar with, and there's a lot of different names for these on some of them, but I went with the ones that hopefully people have heard of before, and if you haven't heard of them, that's fine. So flowering rush is one of them that we have here in Nebraska. If you're familiar with wild celery, it looks very common and very similar to wild celery. But basically, these are these linear leaves that emerge from that stout rhizome. So remember, if you remember, the rhizomes are underneath in the root systems, and they're the ones that kind of come out of the nodes and the shoots that come out of the nodes underground. A lot of the plants that we're going to talk about today, this is how they kind of ball up for the winter time, and then they sprout again in the spring. So on this plant, the leaves may be emergent, so coming up out of the water. They could float or even be submersed in the water up to several meters. So it just kind of depends. The fruit on these plants will develop as a cluster of follicles, and they have these pretty kind of pinkish clusters of flowers that rise above the water. They grow on shorelines and marshes. Sometimes they're submersed in lakes and streams. Technically, it's an exotic. It was from Europe and also the temperate areas of Asia. Perennial, it sprouts each spring. And then the flowers usually come in midsummer, and then the fruit is set by later summer. The good thing about these plants is that they can provide cover for some waterfowl species. However, there have been studies showing that it does crowd out native species. So it is an exotic, but it is something that we do see here in Nebraska. All right, this is like my favorite aquatic plant. If anyone knows anything or have ever heard of water horsetail, or sometimes people call them puzzle grass, this is really fun. If you look at the picture, you'll notice that it's green, and then there's also some tan kind of black pieces. So basically you can pop it off and like put it back together like a puzzle. So that's sometimes why it's called puzzle grass, and it makes a pop kind of like when you pop bubble wrap. But it's found, these are hollow stems, they're very rigid, and they have a very high silica content. So silica, if you've ever bought like shoes or clothes or purse or something like that, they put those little bags in there to collect moisture so it doesn't get wet. It has a huge high silica content. But these things actually are very old. So about 300 million years ago is when they date these back. But these things are really neat. And they're found in Nebraska pretty much anywhere. They like shallow marshes and waters, lakes and ponds. They usually kind of grow towards the side of a lake or a pond and not necessarily rooted in there or submersed underwater. But new shoots are produced every spring. A lot of people at one time thought there were some medicinal uses for them. People ingested them and used things for kidney disease, tuberculosis, arthritis. Studies actually show that they reduce and they destroy the thiamine that's in your system. So not good. Also, even though it's called a horsetail, horses should not eat it. If they ingest large amounts of it, there's a huge significant risk for them. There's heart issues, there's breathing issues. They kind of know to stay away from it, same with cattle, but there are significant risks to horses. They can develop this thing called equitosis. If they eat it, large amounts of it, it can be fatal to those horses as well. All right, so I don't have a specific species for this one, but sedges, there's a lot of different types of sedges. They look like grass if you've ever seen them, but if you've ever heard sedges have edges. So these appear like a grass when you first look at them, but they have this sac-like structure on them. It surrounds the ovary and the nutlet that's inside. So compared to leaves of a grass, compared to leaves of a sedge, the leaves come off at the stems at 3 angles as opposed to 2 angles like on a normal piece of grass. Some of these species have male and female flowers on separate spikes. Some species have them on the same spike. The sedge shoots will come from the rhizomes earlier in that spring, and the ovary and the nutlet, and that's how they sprout new grasses. There's about 500 species of sedges in North America. They're found pretty much anywhere in forests, wet meadows, fens, prairies, lakes, bogs, any of those things really. But lakes and streams, they have the sedge meadows that kind of are surrounding them. This kind of looks like the annoying grass that you have to walk through to go fishing. But these are really important buffer zones that will capture, that filter the stormwater runoff and protect the water quality. So if anything runs into them, usually it hits the sides first. And this is what's really taking that in and filtering that out before it gets to that water. So they look annoying. They might not be fun to walk through. You could get chiggers, but they are very important for that water quality of that lake. Also, they develop in the fall and they can go dormant over the winter time. And these are huge amounts of food sources for a lot of aquatic animals, things like muskrats, shorebirds, upland birds, waterfowl, all those different types of things will eat them and also use them for cover. All right, bees are pretty common. A lot of people probably have heard of reed canary grass. This one's actually an exotic as well. It's favored by disturbance. So it's one of the first grasses really to sprout in the spring, but they can form these very large, dense colonies by the spreading rhizomes or those shoots that are underneath the ground. Sometimes people will make a leaf whistle. If you've ever used like a piece of Kentucky bluegrass or something like that, and you can blow on it, makes a whistle. The grayish green blades are flat, and a lot of people can get a sound out of them. There's these things called the spikelets. They're initially green, and then they come tinged with purple, and then later in the season, they come this brown kind of feathery appearance is what you see here. A lot of the times they're found on lake shores, stream banks, exposed moist ground, wherever you can find that. Technically, they are a really good stabilizer of the shore. However, there were native species and there were also invasive species. The sad thing is that it's very, very, very hard to find any evidence of those native species. A lot of it are these invasive species, still remains. But again, its success is favored by that disturbance. So there's a very low food value for these, but they do offer cover for a lot of different birds and wildlife. So there's some trade-offs. They're invasive, they spread a lot, but they do offer a lot of cover, but a lot of native species could do that as well. But there's still something that people will see out there in the water. All right, corn dogs, or a lot of people call them broadleaf cattails. There's a couple different species that we have in Nebraska. You may have heard of the narrow-leaved cattail. That one's actually invasive. I cannot tell the difference between the narrow leaf and the broadleaf, but if you have someone that's an expert, they certainly can. There is evidence that the narrow and the broadtail have come together to hybridize to create a new species. But the broadleaf cattail is the one that you see the most common, and it is native. So these are like these corn dog looking things that a lot of people, you can actually eat them. So the brown corn dog or hot dog like part that you see here, you can, if you've ever taken it apart, it's really like feathery, and the pollen that's in those flowers, that's from the male spike. So basically, it sheds the pollen to the wind. So even though these are emergent plants, they still use wind to pollinate. So in the fall, when they start to break apart, the pollen will drift, and hopefully in the hopes of building some new species and some new plants. But these guys, you can't eat them. I've known people that talk about grinding the corn dog like part down into a flour and making bread out of it. So it's good for foragers. Some people have even called this like the supermarket of the swamp. A lot of people will use all the parts of a cattail. But basically what happens is the male spike has tons and tons of these pollen grains in them or anthers, and it sheds it to the wind. But after the pollen has been released, the male flowers will drop off of the stalk, but they're found pretty much anywhere. There's range includes most of the US. They're found in marshes, even roadside ditches or lakes. You can find them pretty much anywhere. A lot of species eat them, so they're very good for wildlife. Muskrats and geese will eat them. The stalks provide a lot of shelter for spawning fish, and then also invertebrates as well. If you ever go macro dipping or macro invertebrate dipping, this is a great place right here to find a lot of things like dragonfly invertebrates or stoneflies or caddisflies. So if you just take your dip net and kind of rub it up against the plants that are in the water, a lot of those invertebrates will stick their eggs or their little small larvae onto those, and you can find a lot of things in there. So very useful, interesting plant. All right, I'm sure a lot of us have heard of American lotus plants. These guys are very large, blue-green leaves. Sometimes they can be about 2 feet in diameter, so they're huge leaves. They don't have the cleft like the water lily. So if you look at a water lily and you look at an American lotus, they're very similar to each other. The leaves and the flowers are solitary, so they're just a single one, not a cluster, but they're really deeply buried and they look like bananas, kind of end to end from each other. These stems are ginormous. Sometimes they can spread in these huge colonies up to about 40 feet or more in a single growing season. So that's a little bit, the school bus is about 30 feet. So if you think about another 10 feet onto that, that's huge. They also have these cone-shaped fruits that are about 4 inches, and they will come up above the water. A lot of people, the flowers that you see here, they're usually about the size of a dinner plate, and they are held up above the water, usually above the leaves, because they will float. So sometimes people put them on the floating plants, but technically they are emergent plants. Sometimes people will see them as a nuisance species. They grow everywhere. They form very large colonies, but a lot of people actually used to eat them. So those indigenous peoples will eat the parts of them, and they said that they were good. So I'm not a very good forager, but if someone's ever tried them, I would love to know what it tastes like. All right, and then you also have the water lily. So the water lily is very similar to that of the American lotus flower. The differences between them are the leaves. So water lilies are going to have these really thick, waxy-like leaves. And then when you look at the leaves, they're also going to have this recognizable little notch in them. The American lotus plants, they're going to be a lot more thin and papery when you touch them. So a little bit different, even though they have the same type of looking flower. They come in the very large sizes, and then the colors also can be very different. So I always thought the American lotus were yellow and water lilies were everything else. They can come in lots of different colors, but it's really the type of leaf when you touch it, and then also the cleft or that little notch in the leaf as well. So these guys, again, same kind of thing, very large floating leaves. They're solitary stalks, and then it rises up above the ground. Each flower will emit kind of this fragrant sweet odor. If you've ever done that, it opens in the morning, it will close in the afternoon, and it will do this for a few consecutive days, and then it will be done. It will develop the fruit below the surface of the water, and then they will be done for the season. But they grow in really quiet, clear ponds and lakes. A lot of the times people's backyard ponds, there's not a lot of currents, there's not a lot of things happening in there, so it's a nice quiet place for these plants to grow. They're very long-lived, they can get very dense, but they can pretty much be found in any of those like quiet, clear areas. So, but both of the American lotus and the water lily, they grow from those rhizomes, and they have tons of different colors. So it's kind of hard sometimes to tell them apart, but there are some distinguishing features. All right, this one's very pretty, and a lot of people don't know that it's invasive, but it's highly invasive. So this is called purple loosestrife. So it kind of reminds me of dotted gay feather, if you know what those are, or also sometimes people think it looks like vervain, that hoary vervain, or the blue vervain that grows by the water. But these leaves are like lance shaped, and they grow in these stalks and these stems, but they're beautiful in color. They're this really deep, rich purple color. They're found in a variety of areas. They pretty much grow anywhere where it's moist soil and shallow waters, and it's a pretty hardy perennial. It survives the winter on woody stalks, and basically what happens is that these clusters of magenta flowers are produced. They kind of feel like tissue paper if you've ever touched them. Like I mentioned, a lot of times they get confused with other things, but these true purple loosestrife are invasive. They were first introduced as soil erosion of the water back in the early 1800s. So they kind of got out of hand, and now we have them. They a lot of the times will block waterways, they'll get clogged in pipes, and they actually do erode when you get these huge dense colonies. They'll so much root system, they just start to implode. So they're not great to have around. They do have an attractant to some of the pollinators though. They're commonly visited by honeybees, which is funny because honeybees are pretty much just cows with wings. They're a domesticated species. They're not native either. They're from Europe. But the introduced species with the exotic species is just kind of interesting. So they're very pretty flowers, but they're highly invasive. All right, and then you get these really cool plants called arrowheads. So if you know the leaf or you know the distinguishing features, the leaves are the distinguishing feature. They're very, very hard to get confused with any other types of plants because of the way they look, but they form these very large colonies. There's about 5 different species of arrowheads here in Nebraska, but they're different types of leaves. So most of them have these arrowhead-shaped leaves. Some of them get really large, some of them are a little bit smaller, but they're avidly eaten by a lot of aquatic organisms. Humans can also eat them. They make these kind of starch-filled tubers at the very bottom. Ever heard anyone call them duck potatoes? They're found in the fall, but you can't eat them. And then the flower stalks are usually up above the water, and they have groups of 2 or 3 in them. And then each flower has these pretty showy white petals with a yellow center in them. And they produce hundreds of these tiny little seed-like fruits, and birds really like to eat them. So they thrive in like those nutrient deep, really spread quickly in the water. So kind of a cool plant, but very common by the edges of waters or lakes or rivers or things like that. All right, so that was a lot of emergent plants. There's a lot that I didn't cover, but we only have so much time. So we're going to go ahead and move on to our submersed plants. So these are going to be kind of a little bit smaller sometimes, but floating pond weeds. So these are the things that a lot of people think are moss or algae, but they're these tiny little leaves. These are actually really good for the environment. They have these submersed leaves. They're very small and narrow. They usually rot away. So the floating leaves are oblong. Sometimes they form these crowded mats with things and they stick to everything. So when you're swimming or your fishing gear, your boat or something like that, they're usually everywhere, but they produce these floating leaves. There's about 16 species of pondweed in Nebraska. They're a very important breeding habitat for aquatic species, especially fish. They're also an indicator species. So if we have these, that indicates to scientists that the health of the organism or the ecosystem is doing very well. But however, there is sometimes an excessive growth, which can cause some issues. So we all know that in Nebraska, we have a lot of farms and we have a lot of pesticide runoffs. A lot of that can run off in those chemicals into the water system and kind of explode the plant population in there, which can kind of choke out the oxygen levels and kind of mess up the pH of the ecosystem as well. But a lot of those has been fueled by all of the nutrients and the chemicals that are being pumped into the water. So it can sometimes cause issues if there's a lot of those nutrients being run off into the water. But a lot of species, they cannot stand turbid waters and they've kind of been disappearing. So again, that kind of hurts the other ecosystems in there as well. All right, sometimes people get these 2 next ones kind of confused, and you can kind of see why they look very similar together. Coontails and something called water milfoil. They look very similar to each other. So this one gets its name because if you look at that feathery, like brush-like appearance, it looks like the back of a raccoon. A lot of people call it raccoon tail or coon tail, but they kind of these bushy upper leaves, and they're very brittle. So if you look very closely at them, there's one erect stem, and then there's lots of little branches coming off of those, and each little branch has like 3 branches, and those 3 branches have 3 branches. So it makes this brush-like appearance, and they get very feathery when you look at them. So but there are tiny little flowers that they're pollinated underwater. So this is one of those few plants that's rare that the pollen actually is moved by the water. So only about 2% of plants in the entire world use this. They're more tolerant actually of polluted and murky water because they're submersed. So a lot of times people will get this caught on their fishing line or on their boats. If you're swimming, you get tangled in it. That's because a lot of it's underwater and it's submersed. A lot of the times when there's a newly constructed reservoir or pond, this is kind of the first plant to take hold on that. They like areas that have a lot of water-rich dissolved nutrients and organic matter in the pond. So oftentimes this is what you're going to see first. All right, and then very similar to this coontail is water milfoil. So there's a couple different species in Nebraska. There's 4 species, I guess. There's also something a lot of people may have heard called Eurasian water milfoil. This one is highly invasive. Even just a little leaf can grow a new plant. So it's highly invasive. So that's always why they tell you to clean, drain, dry all of your water equipment, your fishing gear, your tackle, your boats, empty your ballast water, all of that stuff. So this is why, because sometimes we're not worried about the things we can see. It's the little tiny stuff in the water that we can't see. But this is a submersed plant that's very widespread in Nebraska. It gets kind of that bristly-like appearance as well. A lot of the times it's found in hard water, so it can accumulate that lime on it, very similar to like your showers or your sinks, and it becomes encrusted and brittle. There's also something called naiad, which a lot of people get these two confused with, but they're tiny flowers. They're held just above the surface. And then again, that Eurasian water milfoil is highly invasive. All right, and this is also one of my favorite plants. This is called the bladderwort. So not only is it a plant that's in the water, but it also is a carnivorous plant. So one of the few that's in Nebraska. When people think carnivorous plant, they think of like the Venus flytraps. We don't have those. They're not quite to that level. They can eat something about the size of a tiny little microscopic phytoplankton, or they can go all the way to like a mosquito larva. So we're not talking like a fly or a person or anything here. It's really small, but still they technically are a carnivorous plant. So they float about 2 to 3 meters in length. They pop up above the water. They're usually yellow, and the flowers, they're kind of little pitcher. You know what a pitcher plant is? They look like a little pitcher, kind of similar to this. They're called bladders, and this is what houses the carnivorous tendencies of the plant. So they have little spines that's located on the margins of the plant. And basically the lips of the flowers, they secrete this really sugary substance in their glands that kind of draws in those animals to come eat it, like those small little tiny insects. So they come in, the antennas kind of help animals guide them into the center of the plant to that sugary substance. And then when those insects come and brush up against those hairs, it traps it with a rush of water, it kills it, it drains it, and it eats it. So it slowly dissolves it. So it can reset in about 20 minutes. So by the time that it drains all the water, gets ready again, it can go again to eat something in about 20 minutes. So it can eat quite a bit throughout the day. And again, we're talking about like mosquito larva here is like the biggest size it could take, but still considered an aquatic carnivorous plant. There's lots of different types of bladderwort. This is one that's very common in Nebraska. We see them quite frequently along lakes and ponds, bogs, rivers, that kind of stuff. They're usually yellow. They'll come up above the surface, but they provide a lot of food and cover for fish as well. So very important plants and very interesting plants of Nebraska. And I think that's it. All right. That went really fast today, I thought. So I see we have a couple comments and I'll get those here in a second. So like I mentioned earlier, we're 3 episodes in, and so we have 3 more. So next week is kind of a weird week with the 4th, but we're still having science of. So hopefully after all the hot dogs and potato salad that you eat, you can chill on the couch and listen to some science of mountain lions. Just kind of a disclaimer for everybody here. This will be about the biology and the life history of mountain lions. It will not be anything about the regulations or anything like that. We're going to talk biology, not permits or anything like that. So just kind of a disclaimer, and then animal communication, and then we'll finish off with clouds in July, and then we're done until October, I think. All right, so if you liked this, you want to share, we have a whole playlist on our educational YouTube channel called Science of. You can watch lots of different videos. They're free to watch. You can download them and watch them. And then also our Facebook page and our Instagram page. There's all of our events on there. There's fun facts. There's what's going on in Nebraska, what's going on at Game and Parks. So I highly suggest following that to get all the intel about what's going on. And then we also have the Nebraska Wildlife Education website. We have free downloadable activities and a lot of information about workshops. There's some scavenger hunts and lots of cool stuff on there as well. All right, so that's all I got. We'll see everyone hopefully next week for mountain lions after the 4th. I do notice that there is some comments, so I'm going to stop sharing and let's go ahead and get to those. All right, someone asked, when does this end? Well, right now, 4 o'clock. Thank you, Monica. Interesting stuff. Someone said they'll have to go make some cattail bread. I would love to know how this goes. I've heard it's a very tedious, long process, but it does work. And I'm sure there's a lot of cool stuff on the internet that you can find about that as well. But I hope that it works for you. So, all right. So I hope you learned a little bit about some aquatic plants in Nebraska and hopefully see them in a different light. So they're not a nuisance. There are some that are invasive, but overall their indicators are very good, healthy aquatic ecosystem. So I think a lot of you hopefully will see them in a different light and understand how they work within the ecosystem. Someone also asked, is duckweed another name for something that you covered? So duckweed, pondweed, they're totally different. There's a really good guide that someone gave me. It's not in print anymore, but I know you can still buy it. It's called Through the Looking Glass, the Guide to Aquatic Plants. And it goes through, it's technically a guide from Wisconsin, but a lot of the stuff that we have is very relevant to what they have as well. It's a really good guide. It shows pictures, very close intel of what the branches and the leaves look like. Tomorrow, I will go ahead and get an email out to everyone that registered and give them some more information. And I can include a link to that guide as well, since it's pretty good. So if someone's really interested in this, they can certainly look at that as well. So, all right. Well, I don't see any more comments or anything. So thank you, everyone. I hope you have a good rest of your week, a good weekend, and also a good holiday. So we will see you next Thursday at 3 o'clock for mountain lions. So can't wait. Thanks, everyone.